Hello and welcome to Premier Unbelievable. I'm delighted to be here at John Colet School in Wendover with an outstanding group of sixth formers as we're tackling the question of science, religion and reality. Past, present and future, a big topic, and we've got some big guests with us. To my left, we've got Professor Paul Ewart, Professor of Atomic and Laser Physics at Oxford University. And to my right, we've got Professor Simon Walker-Samuel, who's Professor of Biophysics at UCL. Can we give him a big welcome and round of applause? How science and religion interrelate and the dynamics between them and how that works is such a big question. It's been debated for many centuries now. Looking at the present, asking what gives the best account of the real actual world that we live in? Are these competing accounts or do these actually work together? Well, Professor Paul Ewart is a believing and practicing Christian. And Professor Simon Walker-Samuel is a trustee with Humanists UK. So we've got very different ideas represented here. Asking the question as well, what it means to be human in a world of spacefaring, traveling to the moon and Mars, people living in low Earth orbit for long periods of time, genetic engineering and advanced nanotechnology, and of course, artificial intelligence are raising real questions about what it means to be human in this world and what it will mean going forward as our technology becomes more and more advanced. I'll just start with you, Paul. Why don't you introduce your position as well as tell us a bit more about your background and how you see the answer to the question of how science and religion interrelate.
Well, hello, and it's nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I started life in Belfast. You might have picked that up from my accent already. And I've lived in England for over 50 years and haven't shaken it off. Anyway, I've spent most of my life doing physics research and teaching in Oxford in the area of atomic physics and lasers, developing new techniques for studying atoms and molecules, and then applying those to problems in chemistry and engineering. And then towards the end of my career, I took on the job of being chair of Christians in Science, and then had a brief spell in Cambridge at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. I'm still doing a bit of part-time research, so I should say that I'm an emeritus professor, as it were, which is a polite word for retired. But I'm doing some part-time research with some colleagues, carrying on the work I was doing in Oxford.
Excellent. And over to you, Simon. Why don't you give us more of your background, some of the research you're doing now, which is really amazing, and also how you see the answer to this question.
Okay, my background is also physics. So I did undergraduate physics a while ago now. That led into applications in medicine. So biophysics is now sort of my area of speciality, but increasingly it's at the interface of computing, AI, those kind of things, developing things called digital twins. So if a patient comes with cancer, what we're trying to aim to do is individualize, for example, their treatment using mathematical models, biophysical simulations, things like that. To really kind of tailor treatments in a way that we can't currently do. So that uses a lot of physics, it uses a lot of medicine, biology, chemistry, all the disciplines kind of thrown together. So I do slightly less physics than I did before, but I still like to call myself a physicist. But it's very much kind of computer science, AI, those kinds of things. And I think, so I've always had an interest in philosophy. And I think some of the areas that you're just describing, particularly the interface with AI, is really interesting at the moment. Questions around consciousness, things like that. And I think there's an interesting angle that physics and computing can take on that.
Now, you're a trustee of Humanists UK. How does science inform the question, what does it mean to be human? And does that leave any space for sort of the non-science, the non-material?
So yes, so my main understanding of the world and my place and of other humans in the world draws on science. And I think it's the best way of understanding the world for all sorts of reasons that we can delve into, mainly because it takes subjectivity out of it as much as possible. So all the kind of hopes and sort of human desires and needs that can bias the way we view the world and interpret and understand it, science really tries to kind of put them to one side and go, okay, without all of that kind of background bias and sort of expectations about the world, how can we best understand it? And that's how kind of science works, less so how we use that to sort of frame our own place in the world. But humanism really draws on that idea that science is the best way to understand the world.
So for our audience, for those listening at home, when you say you're a humanist, that's not exactly the same as being an atheist, but they're not a million miles apart. How would you describe that?
No, so most humanists are atheists. So atheists withhold a belief in gods, essentially. That sort of encapsulates all atheists. Some atheists go as far as saying they don't believe a god exists. Others just say, I'm withholding my belief because I don't think there's enough evidence to support belief in a god. So that's what atheism is. But humanism is more than that. It's not just what we're not, as in believers in God. It's also kind of celebrating humans for what they can do, having an optimism about humans, what we can bring to the world, how we can protect it, how we can sort of develop as humans, valuing things like empathy, art, those kind of things. So it's not just about saying, I don't believe there's a God. It's only one very small part of it. It's about celebrating humans and what they can do.
Or when you say things like empathy and art, would you say there's a purely scientific explanation for things like that, maybe an evolutionary one? Or
yes,
yeah,
that's what I believe. Now, belief, I'm sort of using belief cautiously because my use of the word belief is what I think is most likely to be true. So I kind of absorb that in the way that I then understand the world. I go, okay, I believe it. I think that's a fact. With a sort of holding it slightly at arm's length at all times. You know, there's always uncertainty. There's always sort of, room to kind of go, well, I might be wrong about that thing. So that's my idea of belief. But to your question about empathy, yes, I think empathy arises from our internal brain states. It's because we can model other people. So empathy is about saying, okay, I'm like this as a human. I can see you're a human or some other agent in the world. So maybe animals as well. But it's a purely physical, material thing. It doesn't go beyond the material.
Right, excellent. I look forward to lots of questions coming about these topics later on, so do be thinking of them as we go. Now, from a trustee in Humanists UK to the former president of Christians in Science, Paul, do you think that there are some things that science can't explain? We've talked about science maybe being the best method for explanation because it's repeatable and testable and you could do peer review, but are there things that sit outside of the realm of science then?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, Simon, I agree wholeheartedly with your ideas of science, exactly the same as mine. Our approach to the natural world is how to understand it in physical and natural terms. We don't say, oh, here's something I don't understand. God must have done it. That's not the way we approach our science. God has given us our rationality, our brains to think things through. That's the aspect of us that helps us relate to God. So it's a gift from God that we can understand the world at all. And that, as a Christian, I see that as a tremendous gift. And we shouldn't just take that for granted because years and years ago, people were trying to understand the world and they came up with all kinds of myths and ideas to try to explain what was going on. And there's a lot of chaos about it. And people thought, well, you can't understand it, or there's some kind of capricious gods pulling strings and we'll never understand it. And it was the Judeo-Christian idea that there was a creator God who made things in a rational way that made it possible to do science, to look for laws that the world would work in a rational and predictable way. And that's why the modern science grew up in a Christian culture. It got fed into from Muslim culture a little bit with maths and the Greeks' ideas as well. But it was in the Christian idea that you could find laws of nature that really got modern science going in the late Middle Ages. So Christianity and science are very closely related in that sense. And we have a desire to know the truth, to understand the world around us and to improve it. And so I think that when you ask, are there things that science can't solve? The short answer is yes, of course, because science is excellent at doing what science does. It looks for natural causes for the effects that we see in the world. And that's what science is doing. And therefore, it limits itself to its field of study. And the methods that you use in science will determine the kind of things that you can discover. One of my favorite jokes from many years ago was about a guy who was doing research to find out how many people in California had a telephone. And his friend asked him, well, what did you find out? And he said, 100%. He said, wow, everybody? He said, yes, everybody I phoned up had one.
So,
Boom. So the method you use determines what you'll find out. So if you're using physical science to discover physics or what's going on, you'll get answers in those terms. But that's not to say that's the end of reality. Reality can exist beyond those things. And I think that's what makes us human and distinguishes us from animals, that there are aspects to our humanity that are more than just the physical, and can't be totally explained in terms of atoms and molecules.
So you don't see religion as sort of a competing explanation for reality with science?
Absolutely not. It's complementary. Science will tell us a lot about what's going on in natural terms in the natural world and our natural aspects. But if there are things beyond that, then science is limited because of the methods it uses. And it would be a statement of faith to say that there's nothing beyond science, because science can't tell you that. That would be a statement of faith, as it were. And therefore we have to, science would tell us, if you can't determine those things using scientific methods, then try something else. And use other methods to discover whether there's something beyond that.
Right. Simon, would you agree with that, or are there points of disagreement?
The way I see science, so there's sort of one way of sort of framing science as a body of knowledge. That's kind of what, when you go to school, you learn facts that kind of science is deduced. So that's kind of one definition for science. But the way I see it more in my day-to-day work as a scientist is a set of methods for best understanding the world. So you say, okay, how can I most rigorously and reproducibly form a model that represents the kind of things I'm seeing in the world around me? So, if I throw an apple up in the air and it lands on the floor, I can make a model. Newton developed a model for, exactly how and in what way that happens and in a generalizable way. So if any things that can fall outside of that world either can't be thrown up in the air or pushed or perturbed in any kind of meaningful way, may as well not exist. And at that point, you have to suspend your belief in them, I'd argue. So if they have no kind of meaningful interaction with the world, they don't in any way interact with the world in a way that you can measure or detect or kind of determine, then they may as well not exist. And so sort of saying things are outside of the scope of science just means that you can't actually access them in any meaningful kind of way. And so that's where the sort of supernatural begins, this sort of world of, well, we don't really know, so we'll kind of sort of fill in the gaps. This idea of the God of the gaps, that we don't quite understand it. We can't measure it. We can't sort of interact with it in any meaningful way. It doesn't really exist, I would say. So that's where I sort of suspend my belief. I don't see any evidence to induce a God hypothesis in what I do, in my science or in my world more broadly. I grew up without that idea in my life, and I sort of feel quite grateful for that, because I can feel like I can see it at a distance and go, right, I don't really subscribe to that. I don't see the need. So that's probably why I ended up a humanist, because I don't really feel that need to use a God to understand the world. And it's because I don't see a sort of meaningful interaction between the world and a God.
So sort of Laplace's famous answer to Napoleon, I have no need for that hypothesis. I don't need to bring God into it. So Paul, over to you then. Is this just a case of you've got science and then you have special revelation, and we don't really know how to categorize that, and so God just fills the gaps of what we don't know, and everything else is just special revelation. It's not repeatable or testable.
Well, no, I think, as I said before, I think science will help us understand the world in the terms that science can teach us about, and that if there's anything beyond that, then science can't help us. That we use our reason and we think logically and honestly and truthfully as best we can to understand things. But as the famous scientist Pascal once said, the supreme function of reason is to show man that there are some things beyond reason. And although we don't get evidence, we pick up a stone that says made by God on it, as it were, there are evidential points that point us towards the existence of a supreme mind behind the universe. We see the order in the universe, not just with apples falling on the earth, but that same gravity works in the most distant stars that we can see. And this holistic view of the universe, I think, fits with the Bible's view of God and creation. The Bible doesn't have supernatural in it either. You may be interested to know that the word supernatural doesn't occur in the Bible. The Hebrew doesn't even have a word for it. So everything that happens is ultimately due to God anyway, and nature is just what God does. And so I don't, in my science, think, gosh, I don't understand this. It must be some kind of supernatural thing. We understand the world in its own terms. And I see God as a complementary context in which I can do my science. It doesn't replace it. It enhances it. It complements it, because we're talking about different kinds of reality here. There's more to our lives and our humanity than just the physical atoms that we're made of.
Right, so you outright reject the God of the gaps hypothesis. Yours is more of a holistic, I see it all together as like a big painting with a patchwork, and a lot of it can be painted with science, but there's this whole other like overarching narrative or overarching picture that holds it all together, that is God's.
Yes, I see human beings as being body, mind, and spirits, a holistic thing. We're not like ethereal spirits living in a little shell, like a snail in a shell, as it were, and it exists separately. Science has developed up to the point using the method of reductionism, breaking everything down to the atoms and molecules. And that it works great as far as it goes. But actually, we're discovering now that that doesn't always give us the best explanation. And people are coming to realize we have to think of another framework of explanation called emergence. The properties of stuff can emerge when they get sufficient level of complexity and so on. And you can't explain everything just in terms of the atoms and molecules. The properties can be created out of the natural world, as it were, and that's built into the way God has made it, I think. It was interesting, actually, that it was an atheist scientist, a very famous scientist called J.B.S. Haldane. He put it this way. He said, if my thought processes are nothing but the motion of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose my thought processes are true, and therefore no reason to suppose my brain to be made up of atoms. So this thoroughly materialistic view is self-defeating. It says that we can't really know anything ultimately, because it's just what atoms and stuff are doing. There has to be more to it than that. And so the evidence I see in the world points to a logical, rational creator that we can interact with. And so we have to do that in its own terms, get beyond the physical and talk about the mental and the spiritual aspects of humanity.
Right, there's plenty there to respond to. I'll give you the floor and then I'll ask you another question.
Okay, I think so. Assumptions are the key thing. When you do science, so I take it back to the kind of professional, sort of formal doing of science. Often we present our results, with a slide, PowerPoint slide deck, and we go, okay, here's the introduction to what I've done, laying out my assumptions. So I assume that this, and this. I go off, I do some experiments, and because of my assumptions, I'm making this set of conclusions, right? And it's quite good fun at the end of scientific presentations to go, okay, I'll take you back to slide 1 where you said your assumption was this. What if that's not true? What if that's wrong? Doesn't that undermine all of your conclusions? You see people's face often turning white, and because he pointed out there's a fundamental sort of misunderstanding of that's fundamental to what they've done. So that's kind of, and you always have assumptions. And the key thing is to always be as aware of those assumptions as possible. Now, in what you're just saying, Paul, and maybe I'm mischaracterizing this, so tell me if I am, but your underlying assumption is that there is a God, like a sort of universal consciousness that you can interact with, and that kind of guides the way the universe works. And we then move on to the kind of results section of the presentation, and we all see the same data. And I'd say, well, hold on, what if there isn't this sort of global superpower? Why would you believe that? Does that undermine the conclusions? And probably the conclusions will be the same. And I'd argue that's because it's redundant. and this goes back to the hypothesis. I have no need for that hypothesis. I don't think that there's any need to interpret a global sort of super cosmic intelligence within any part of the world. And I don't see any evidence for it. But we're looking at the same evidence. So it's really interesting. And is that because we're predisposed, maybe through our upbringing or whatever it is, to look for that in a way that, a Christian might look for it in one way, a Muslim might look for it another way, a Hindu might look for it in a different way entirely. Whereas I sort of check out of the whole process and go, I don't think it's probably there at all. And if it is, it doesn't have any influence. So the models that I then build don't really need that in there. Both my scientific models that I use in, my professional world, but also my day-to-day world. I just don't feel the need to include it. It seems sort of redundant to my worldview. Yet I'm here and kind of talking and kind of, coexisting in a way that, there seems there should be this fundamental disconnect between our two worldviews, but there isn't.
Yes. Yeah. Well, before I ask you another question, I want to ask you, is your God hypothesis, for lack of a better phrase, is it a premise or the conclusion?
It's neither, really. It's not. I think I would kind of disagree, Simon, in the sense that I don't start off with my belief in God and therefore I go on to do my science. I was interested in the science at your age here, and wanted to be a scientist before I became a Christian. And when I became a Christian, it didn't change my desire to do science. I do science on its own terms. I don't do science because I'm a Christian. I don't base my science on the belief that God exists, because I don't need to do that. Science will work, whether God exists or not, in that sense. But the reason why it works, it needs an explanation. The reason why there's anything at all needs an explanation, and that's not a scientific one, if you like. There's a famous philosopher at the time of Newton called Gottfried Leibniz, who asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist at all? And that's the kind of metaphysical question, the question that goes beyond science, that religion is trying to answer for us, if you like. Why are we here at all? Does it mean anything to ask that question? I mean, there are some philosophers in the last century who thought that if you couldn't answer questions using science by an empirical method, then the question was meaningless, and which meant that all religions were meaningless. But of course, that philosophy itself fell by its own petard, as it were, that you couldn't prove that either, that the only things that real are things that you could prove. That's an assumption. So I think that I see my science as a part of my life that I enjoy doing, and it's a gift, I think, to be able to use to help other people. Been involved a wee bit in medical work as well. We'll talk about that afterwards. So I see the big picture as God giving me the meaning and purpose in my life, why we're here, to express the love of God. And you can't reduce love to atoms and molecules. And love is a real thing. It's what makes us get up in the morning to interact with other people. And because it can't be measured in atoms and molecules doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's part of what it means to be human and to exist. And I think the message of the Bible is that we were created because God loves us, and he wanted to make us to love and us to love him. So you can't answer that question using science, but that doesn't mean it's a meaningless question.
Well, I wonder if I can just interject, because we're popping up loads of things I want to keep throwing back. I do find it very interesting that neither of you were raised religious, and yet you've both ended up becoming really accomplished physicists at some of the best institutions in the world, but you've come to very different conclusions. Like you say, love can't be explained by atoms and chemicals, but it might be able to be explained through evolutionary biology. And you've said here, why is there something rather than nothing? Your answer to that seems to be, well, we don't need God to answer that. I mean, why do we have to have something bigger? And I just wonder if you could flesh that out a bit more for the students here.
I'll try. So why are we here such a difficult question? If I feel like if there was an obvious answer to that, it would be written in the stars. If there was a sort of celestial, a divine intelligence kind of guiding and was invested in how we lived our lives and what we do in it, they would have provided clearer directions for doing so. And that leads me again more to think, well, perhaps there isn't. Perhaps meaning is something that we need to find ourselves, which is quite a liberating idea, that we can just find our own meaning in our lives. We have evolved as a species, as you say, as a sort of social set of apes, basically, who have now kind of specialized in all these kind of fascinating ways and are obviously really skilled at doing all sorts of things. But equally, we aren't particularly exceptional. We think of ourselves exceptional. And I think that's a product of our ability to kind of empathize with others and look for other agents in the world, that we think we're special. And actually, I don't think we are. We're a tiny speck. We're a tiny planet occupying a small region of space, and we don't seem to be replicated anywhere else in the universe. So I don't actually think we're that special. But we're here, we're conscious, we're kind of here together. We might as well optimize our well-being in a way that's commensurate with the way that we've evolved with each other. And we've evolved to be social. We've evolved to kind of need to reproduce, to get on with each other, all those kind of things. So I think you're right. We can explain the ways we feel we need to be in the world, our kind of moral systems, all those kinds of things, as product of evolution, probably. That seems a much more simple and likely explanation. And this kind of goes to parsimony, this idea of having the simplest possible explanation for things. Invoking a superintelligence, like a cosmic superintelligence, I think is not a simple answer. And I really don't see that there's evidence for it. Otherwise, it would be written in the stars. We'd be able to see it everywhere. There'd be signs. And I think the religious response to that is often, well, you have to have faith. You have to kind of be confident this exists. Well, maybe it just doesn't exist.
I've got to throw that back to you, Paul. Is there evidence for God?
I think there is. And when we talk about evidence is not the same as proof. Evidence has to be interpreted. One of my favorite stories is about this guy who went to the doctor, and he said to the doctor, "Can you help me? I'm dead." And the doctor says, "No, you can't be dead because you've just been speaking to me. Dead people don't talk." And he said, "Oh, yes, they do. I've heard lots of stories, people hearing voices from beyond the grave." And he said, "Well, no, you can't be dead because you walked here, didn't you?" They said, "Yeah, but you've heard the expression, you're a dead man walking." All sorts of people walking around when they're dead. So the doctor says, "Well, look, when you're dead, your heart stops, so you don't bleed. Dead men don't bleed." And the guy says, "Well, all right." So the doctor takes his thumb and pricks it. And sure enough, out comes a speck of blood. And the guy says, "Well, what do you know? Dead men do bleed." You see, you can present evidence and you can interpret it depending on your worldview, as it were. If you're going to start off with, "I cannot ever believe in God," then you have to interpret things without God. And likewise, you might want to try to fit God into your explanation for the world. I absolutely agree with you, Simon, that the assumptions we bring to these things can determine and tilt us to one way or another. But I think we need to be open to the evidence. And that brings me to why there isn't this sign in the sky saying God made the universe. Because what he wants us to have with him is not just to believe that he exists, but to trust him and to respond to his love. And you can't do that by forcing people. And you can't develop a relationship with a friend if you're constantly asking for proof that they're still your friends. And so God has to make the world in such a way that we're open and free to choose and not totally determined to believe certain things or forced to believe in him. He wants us to respond to his grace and his love. And that's why the world is so delicately balanced. We are free to choose. And that makes our moral choices real moral choices. There is a real right and a real wrong, a real good and a real evil, and we're asked to choose between them. And if there's no God, if there's no ultimate standard of right and wrong, then it doesn't matter what we do. But none of us really believes that.
Well, we're getting into philosophy here. I'm sure we're generating some good questions that we'll be getting from you guys in a moment. But before we get to all that, just bringing it to technology, especially seeing as we've got a really outstanding model builder just here to my right. Paul has raised some examples like Newton and Faraday and Pascal of scientists who were religious, but we've also acknowledged here that there was a time when it was all myth and people explained lightning through Thor striking his hammer and stuff like that. And as we've advanced and looking at the scale of where we could advance, do you think that religion will retreat as technology advances, that the empty space that, as you say, religion fills, as that diminishes, the frontier is just going to be populated by science and religion will decline?
I don't know is the answer, because I think it's quite a human thing to be religious. It does occupy a lot of useful facets of humanity, so it kind of removes a lot of uncertainty, fear of death, that kind of gets taken out the equation. So I can see why religion had first arose as a phenomenon, and I can see why it might continue to persist. My opinion, I don't know, your minds may differ in that interpretation. Most scientists, or fewer and fewer scientists, are religious, particularly in the physical sciences. The majority are not religious, it seems, these days. It tends to go with the more developed a country is, the less religious it is becoming, with the notorious exception of the US.
Right.
No one's quite sure why that is, but it's a bit of an outlier.
It's an interesting place.
It's an interesting place, particularly at the moment. So will religion die out? I think if times ever became harder, I think people would turn back to religion,
right,
just for the reassurance it gives. I would caveat that with saying the existence of belief doesn't confirm what is being believed.
No, yes, of course.
So because people are religious doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah, so it's maybe religion's had a sort of an evolutionary survival benefit, which a lot of great humanists do think. What do you think? Do you see much in the correlation between developed countries and more scientific knowledge and less religious practice?
Well, I think there may be reasons for that. There are sociological reasons for why people have one religion rather than another, and there are certain sociological reasons that can be used to explain what's happening in the United States at the moment and how the distortion of Christianity by politics has taken place. But that doesn't mean that real Christianity is no longer true just because it's been perverted and distorted by politics. If we look back the last few thousand years, I think you see a profound effect of especially the Christian religion on the world in which we live. The whole idea of not inflicting cruelty and caring for unwanted babies, abolishing slavery, the whole idea of human rights are the products of the Christian effect on Western civilization and the world as a whole. It has been a profound effect, and Jesus had said, called upon his followers to be salt and light, to change the world, and I think Christianity has changed the world. And don't take it just from me. There's a wonderful book called Dominion by Tom Holland that you should read, and that charts, and he's not a Christian, he charts the effect of Christianity on the improvement of humanity throughout the world. And that's a profound evidence, if you like, of the effect, positive effect of religion on the world. Matthew Paris, for example, an avowed atheist, has said that Africa, for example, needs Christianity because of the effect it has on bringing relief to the poor and so on. So it's a profound motivator for helping others. Humanists do the same thing, and that's wonderful, but I think we need to acknowledge that there's something in us which struggles against our selfishness. And I think that that's where Christianity can help, because it offers not just a guide as to what is right, but a spiritual assistance that God comes and changes us from within to help us live as we should. And I found that in my own life as an experimental scientist, when I tried to be good, but I felt I kept failing. And it was only when I actually asked God to help me that I started to notice a real effect So it does work experimentally in my experience. I know Simon is wonderfully able to be good on his own, but I need his help. But
I find it hard to believe you're a particularly wicked person who was fudging all their data and cheating papers.
not in my science.
No, I'm sure not. Before we go to questions, this came up and I really wanted to make sure I asked you about it. The word reductionism has come up, and I'm dealing with two people who deal with physics on the atomic level. Do you think that an ultimate explanation can be found sort of building from the ground up? So, human behavior and the bigger things in the world can be explained maybe by sociology, but sociology can be explained by biology, and biology can be explained by chemistry, and chemistry can be explained by physics. So physics maybe can be explained by pure maths. And so we can maybe draw a scientific explanation for the whole world. Is that something you would ascribe to?
Yes, in principle. Maybe not in practice,
right?
Because it is so complex.
Yeah.
And I think the complexity is where we get caught in this idea, particularly. So this came up before about whether can you explain love atomically? And I think if you made a scale model of the brain from the kind of molecular level upwards that was a perfect representation of a human brain, embedded with all the experiences and upbringing that a normal human had, you'd see love in there. You'd see all the other things, all the other parts. It's mechanics. There's no magic. There's no kind of hidden extra ingredient that makes us human, in a way that's different to an animal, in a way that's different to any other material. And this idea of emergence of things like emotions or simple things like temperature. Temperature is an emergent phenomenon. All the molecules vibrate individually, and you get this thing appearing that we call temperature. It's just the complexity of the system that stops us being able to model it. If we had a big enough computer, we could probably do it. We'd probably simulate it, and we'd see all of the kind of things that we see in the world. So I think that is my expectation. No one's been able to do that yet, but all the signs are. The more and more complex our models become, the more and more they capture the real, the reality of the world. We've got models of the universe coming together, with black holes being created and this kind of thing. And they seem to do a pretty good job. I think we can do that. I don't think there's a magic extra ingredient that we don't know about. We see evidence for it. Whether there's a radar to the, this cosmic super intelligence, some sort of antenna or something, we just don't see it. I think we are just material beings. Which is quite a kind of, it's quite a hard thing to get your head around, potentially. It doesn't necessarily fit with the models of the world that we get given as we grow up. So, there may be a sort of adjustment to get to that, but I think that is ultimately what we are.
Excellent. We're going to make sure we take your questions now, but first of all, can we give them a round of applause and say thank you?
If you talk about fine-tuning in physics, it is usually being used as an observation of a specific system, and within that system, the question is that a hint for an explanation?
When you compare any two theories, one theory can't taunt another theory with a fact that neither of them explains.
You think that the underlying mind or the designer, or whatever is responsible, was constrained at all in designing that universe?
In 1998, we discovered the cosmological constant. That cemented in one of the best cases of fine-tuning.
Apparently, if we take that seriously, there has been a designer, a mind that designed the universe, but then it's not powerful enough to have us figure out morals for ourselves. It has to come back and intervene at that point. Is that not something that concerns you?
Then we're talking moral philosophy, and I'm not a moral philosopher. You're not a moral philosopher. I'm not sure. You're a philosopher of mind? Yeah. I mean, is there anyone in the house?
So, Paul, first question, how has your religious faith motivated your research?
To be honest, I'm not sure that my religious faith motivates my research. To be honest, I do it because I'm interested in it. I thought it's fascinating stuff, how these atoms and molecules work. My faith affects the way I do my science. And ultimately, in what I do, the kind of research I do. So, for example, I started off doing research that was very fundamental of quantum optics and how the quantum mechanics of how light interacts with matter. But that turned out, some of the things that we were doing turned out to be useful, and started to apply them to mitigate climate change, for example, studying the atmosphere and detecting the molecules that were harming us. And so I was able to turn it to good use. And I found that very satisfying, that starting up with fundamental science turned out to have a use. It also helped get money to do it, actually. Other people find it useful. So I think that I have found that doing science, because it ultimately will help other people, is a motivation, but it doesn't help me actually do it. It's a motivator, if you like. I want to do something that's useful, will help other people.
Very good. Thank you. Great question. Next question. Yes. So, Professor Walker-Samuel, can the shortcomings or deficiencies in our equipment be a reason why we can't detect God or higher presence?
I guess it could be, but equally we tend to build equipment to measure things that we suspect will be there. So like the Large Hadron Collider you probably heard about in Geneva. So we fire protons, as fast as we can at each other and then get them to collide and then see what comes out. And we have detectors to try, because we know what to expect to see, for example. So we know what is likely to happen based on theory, and we've been developing theory for a long time. We've been developing experiments for a long time. And the more and more we do that, the less and less we have recourse to supernatural explanations for things. And that gap, and that's what I was referring to as the God of the gaps, which I know can be a bit of a contentious thing, but those gaps are getting smaller where people start to evoke God as an explanation. So if anyone's got an idea for a machine that can measure the divine, I think you get a Nobel Prize quite quickly, because it would be so unexpected, because we just don't expect to see it.
Great question. Next question for anyone. Yes, at the back. Right, excellent. So a question for you again. What I believe you're referring to is the fine-tuning of the universe, sort of the real fundamental constants and quantities underpinning the very fabric of reality. Does that make you think at all about God, or do you have another explanation?
I've heard this idea many times of fine-tuning of the universe, that we have lots of parameters in our physical models that we can, if we slightly change them, then we see a universe potentially that wouldn't support life. Okay, and the standard response to that from a non-religious person is called the weak anthropic principle, which is to say, well, of course, because we are sentient beings within that universe, making models of the universe that say, well, we wouldn't have a universe if it were different. Well, there's a sort of circular argument within that. I can kind of imagine an experiment that would be amazing to be able to do, but can't be done, but a theoretical experiment where you'd say, okay, let's measure a whole load of universes. Half of them were made by a creator God, half of them weren't. How were they different? How do they differ? What do the parameters look like? And of course, you can't do that. But embedded, you then realize in that assumption about the fine-tuning argument is that there is a creator God. And this is what I'm talking about in assumptions at the start. If you assume there's a creator God, then you kind of go onto this fine-tuning framing. If you don't, you say, well, this is just how the one universe we know about, of which we see a tiny fraction of, happens to appear to us. So we've got no other reference frame to compare it against. So there's a kind of circular kind of set of arguments, and fundamentally, ultimately, you have to go, we just don't know. We don't know. Was this universe made by a kind of creative superintelligence? It seemed like a kind of slightly unwieldy hypothesis to me, not to others. I just go with a simple answer that we just don't know at this point, and probably not.
You said earlier that we're not that special. Do you think sentient life like us was inevitable, given all the things that have happened?
I think we're as inevitable as water flowing downstream in a river.
Right.
So we're a natural physical process, an incredible one, but I'm saying incredible from the perspective of being that thing. So of course I'm going to say that, because I'd look around and go, wow, this is incredible. Well, it's the only universe we know. It's the only experience we know. So I think inevitability is kind of a flawed perspective. What inevitability relies on your knowing of what alternatives were available, and we just don't have that. We only have this one universe.
Excellent. Brilliant. Thank you. Great question. Any other questions? Oh, let me quickly put that to both of you. Paul, do you believe in aliens?
Do I believe that they exist?
Yeah.
No, because I don't have any evidence that suggests they exist. It's possible that there are other life forms in the universe. The probability is very low. It's one of those things where it depends on the assumptions you build into the Drake equation.
Right.
As what the probability is of finding life in another part of the universe. I'm open to that possibility, but I don't think it ultimately affects the existence of God or not. If he decided to bring about life in another part of the universe, well, that's fine with me, as long as they're not little green men that come and eat me. So the short answer is, it's an open question whether there's life in that part of the universe, but I don't think it has a great deal of importance for my faith.
Simon, quickly, what do you think?
I think there's probably life somewhere out there in the universe. It'd be really weird if there wasn't. I don't think we're exceptional, as I said before. Have aliens visited Earth? Probably not. Not yet, but I don't know. Ask Donald Trump.
I was in Los Angeles last week at the Mars Society conference, where the head of the Jet Propulsion Lab from NASA was presenting the latest data that was all over the news a couple of weeks ago of the leopard-spotted rocks that on Earth, those tracks are only left by microbial life. So very exciting, very, very exciting, but a lot more data is needed. But watch this space. Great question. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. So Paul, back to you. It seems very hard to believe there can be any life out there, given the vastness of the universe. I'm also interested in this. Would finding aliens affect your belief in God at all?
Finding aliens existed would not affect my belief in God. No. I absolutely agree with Simon in terms of the way the universe has been constructed has resulted in life. Whether it was inevitable or not is an open question. I think that's not something we could definitely prove. But so it's possible that other kinds of life exist in other parts of the universe. So I'm quite open to that possibility. But again, I don't think it affects whether I believe in God or not. So it was interesting that one of the reasons why the universe is so big and so old is so that we have had time for life to develop in this small part of the universe. But we don't need to worry too much about the fact that we're very small and the universe is very big, because being big doesn't make you important. Importance and significance doesn't depend on your size, nor does it depend on where you are. And so the fact is that we're here and we exist and we ask these questions about the meaning of our lives. And so if there's life in another part of the universe, well, that's fine by me. And maybe, as C.S. Lewis suggested, the fact that it's so far away is God's quarantine. We won't infect it with our selfishness and our destructive urges, as it were. But that's speculation. I think it's an open question, but it doesn't really affect my belief in God.
Excellent. Time for one last question. Yes, you, sir. Okay, so if our purpose in life is to find God, and you try during your whole life and you don't, has that been a failure on you as a person?
I think I'm going to leave that up to God to decide, because I think people come to the question of commitment to God from different backgrounds, as Simon was saying, and people have different obstacles to faith that have been put in their way. And I think God is perfectly able to adjust to each individual and be perfectly just and loving to you. If you find for some reason that at the moment I can't believe in you, it's not believing you exist. I'm not prepared to put my life into your hands, as it were. That's what belief in God means, to trust him, like trusting a friend. And so that's affected by our experience, by our understanding of the example we've seen in other Christians may not be very helpful. And all sorts of reasons can prevent people committing their life in trust to God. But I believe that God loves you and God loves all of us. And ultimately, he'll find a way of bringing us together with him, because that's, I believe, his purpose.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions, John Colet. It's been a pleasure being with you today. You're a credit to your school. Can we give a big thank you to both our guests?